Mrs. Eleanor Carter was having a pleasant evening. She had just attended a charity event in the city, dressed elegantly and feeling satisfied after raising funds for a good cause. The night air was crisp as she drove her luxury sedan through the quiet streets, heading home. She needed to stop for gas, so she pulled into a well-lit station near the highway. It was a routine stop, something she had done countless times before. But tonight would be different. As she stepped out of her car to fill up the tank, flashing red and blue lights suddenly lit up the station. A police car pulled in swiftly, followed by another. The sudden presence of law enforcement caught Eleanor's attention, but she thought nothing of it at first. Perhaps they were just patrolling the area. However, her heart skipped a beat when she noticed the officers walking straight toward her. A tall officer with a stern expression and a firm voice called out, "Ma'am, step away from the vehicle." Eleanor turned to face them, confused but composed. "Excuse me?" she asked politely, unsure of what was happening. "You match the description of someone we're looking for," the officer said. "We need to check your car and your belongings." Eleanor blinked, shocked. "I think there's a mistake. I'm Eleanor Carter. I was just at a charity event." She reached into her purse for her ID, but another officer quickly raised a hand. "Ma'am, keep your hands where we can see them," he ordered. People at the gas station began to take notice. A few passers-by stopped to watch, whispering among themselves. Some even took out their phones, recording the unusual scene. Eleanor felt her face grow warm with embarrassment, but she kept her voice steady. "I don't understand. What exactly am I being accused of?" she asked, her grip tightening on her purse. "We just need to check, ma'am." "Step aside," the officer insisted. Eleanor hesitated. She had always respected the law, but something about this situation felt completely wrong. They had no reason to suspect her, yet they were treating her like a criminal. Her first instinct was to argue, but she knew it wouldn't help. Instead, she took a deep breath and stepped aside as asked. One officer opened her car door and began looking inside without asking for permission. Another went through her purse. Eleanor clenched her fists, her patience wearing thin. "Please, can I call my husband?" she asked, trying to remain calm. The officer closest to her smirked. "You can call whoever you want when we're done." That was the moment Eleanor knew they had made a terrible mistake. They had no idea who her husband was. Her pulse quickened as she realized the gravity of the situation. The officers had acted without proper cause, and now they were about to face the consequences. Eleanor could only imagine what would happen when her husband found out. And he would very soon. Eleanor stood there, her heart pounding, watching the officers go through her belongings as if she were some kind of suspect. The gas station lights flickered slightly, and the murmurs of onlookers grew louder. Some people had already started recording, sensing that something wasn't right. The lead officer rummaged through her purse, flipping through her wallet carelessly, glancing at her ID without much interest. He then looked up at her with a skeptical expression. "This says your name is Eleanor Carter. You expect us to just believe that?" Eleanor exhaled sharply, trying to control her frustration. "That is my name. If you would just take a moment to verify it properly, you'll see that I have no connection to whatever crime you think I'm involved in." The officer exchanged glances with his colleagues. Another officer, a younger one, leaned against her car, acting as if this was all routine. "We're just doing our job, Mom," he said lazily. "Your job?" Eleanor asked, raising an eyebrow. "Your job is to search an innocent woman's car without cause, to humiliate me in front of strangers." The young officer shrugged, "Just following protocol." Eleanor clenched her jaw. She could feel her patience slipping away. She had spent years supporting law enforcement, attending community events, and working on initiatives to improve relationships between the police and the public. And now, here she was, treated like a criminal for no reason at all. A woman in the crowd, holding her phone up to record, stepped forward. "Ma'am, do you want me to call someone for you?" she asked. Eleanor nodded slightly. "If you could, Please contact my husband. Before the woman could dial, one of the officers stepped in. Ma'am, step back. This doesn't concern you, he warned. The woman frowned but backed away slightly, still holding up her phone. Eleanor took a deep breath, choosing her words carefully. I'm going to say this one more time. You're making a mistake. If you check properly, you'll realize who I am. My husband is Commissioner David Carter. There was a brief silence. Some of the officers seemed to pause for a second before exchanging nervous glances. The name Commissioner Carter clearly rang a bell, but the lead officer quickly masked his reaction. Oh yeah, he scoffed, trying to act unimpressed. Well, even if that's true, it doesn't put you above the law. Eleanor crossed her arms. I never said it did, but what it does mean is that you're about to have a serious problem. Another officer hesitated, lowering his voice. Sarge, maybe we should double-check. Not now, the lead officer snapped. We finish what we started. Eleanor remained silent, watching as the officers pretended they still had control of the situation. But deep inside, she knew things were about to change, and they wouldn't like what happened next. David Carter had just finished a long day at work, dealing with the usual flurry of police reports and city meetings. As the commissioner, his job was often stressful, and tonight was no different. He was just about to relax at home when his phone rang. It was an unfamiliar number, but David answered quickly, assuming it was a city matter. However, the voice on the other end was urgent, almost frantic. Commissioner, it's about your wife. She's at the gas station on 5th and Main. And they're detaining her. David's stomach dropped. The voice on the phone was shaky, but it was enough for him to recognize something was wrong. What do you mean they're detaining her? Who's detaining her? He asked, his tone sharp now. The caller quickly explained the situation. Eleanor was at the station when the police officers pulled her over, claiming she matched the description of a suspect. They had begun searching her car without reason, and things were escalating. David's heart raced. He couldn't believe what he was hearing. His wife, someone who had always stood by the community and worked tirelessly for good causes, was being treated like a criminal. Without wasting another second, David grabbed his jacket and keys, rushing out of his office. He couldn't allow this to continue. He wasn't just a husband worried about his wife. He was the commissioner, and no one was going to treat his family this way. As he sped through the streets toward the gas station, his mind raced. What kind of officers would make such a mistake? He couldn't understand how this was happening, but he knew one thing for sure. He had to get there quickly. Within minutes, David arrived at the scene, his unmarked government car pulling into the parking lot. His eyes immediately locked onto his wife, standing there among the officers, looking frustrated but trying to stay calm. His heart sank. He could see that she was upset, and that only fueled his anger. David walked straight up to the group of officers with purpose, his badge clearly visible on his belt. The moment the officers saw him, their confident demeanor faltered. "Step aside, all of you," David said firmly. The lead officer looked hesitant, but when he saw the commissioner, he took a step back, suddenly nervous. "Commissioner Carter," the lead officer said, trying to regain control. "We're just doing our job. Your wife matched the description of someone we were looking for. We were following protocol." David's eyes narrowed. "I don't care about your protocol. My wife is not a criminal. She's Eleanor Carter, and I suggest you start explaining why she's been detained for no reason." The officers exchanged uneasy glances, clearly realizing their mistake. David's tone was unwavering. He wasn't about to let them off the hook. "I want an explanation," David demanded again, his voice cold and authoritative. "And I want it now." The lead officer stammered, trying to find words. "Well, we thought she might be connected to a suspect, but what?" David's voice rose. "You thought? You just decided to stop her and search her. Did you even consider asking for proper identification first?" The officers shifted uncomfortably, some looking down at the ground. David could see their fear now, and he knew they realized how badly they had messed up. But this wasn't over yet. David turned to Eleanor, his gaze softening for a moment. He placed a reassuring hand on her arm. "You're all right. I'll handle this." Eleanor nodded, her eyes filled with a mix of relief and frustration. David wasn't just her husband right now. He was the commissioner, and he wasn't going to let this go. 2 seconds, David stood there, his hands clasped behind his back, staring down the group of officers who had made the mistake of detaining his wife. The tension in the air was palpable. Eleanor, still shaken but trying to remain composed, stood beside him. David could feel his anger simmering beneath the surface, but he knew now wasn't the time for rash decisions. He had to remain in control. The officers seemed uncomfortable under his gaze. Some of them shifted their weight from foot to foot, others avoided making eye contact. The lead officer, who had been in charge of the search, tried to stand tall but looked less confident by the second. David knew this was the moment to make them understand the severity of what had just happened. "I want every single officer involved in this search to step forward," David said, his voice calm but firm. There was no question in his tone. The officers knew he wasn't asking. The lead officer hesitated, then reluctantly took a step forward. The others followed, looking increasingly nervous. David studied them for a moment before speaking again. "You've just made a serious mistake," he said slowly. "You have no idea what it's like to have your wife treated like a criminal, with no cause, no reason. You didn't even check her identification properly before deciding to search her. What were you thinking?" The lead officer opened his mouth to speak but paused, unsure of how to respond. David didn't give him a chance. "Let me remind you," David continued, "that my wife is a respected member of this community. She's been a supporter of the law and worked alongside you all to improve relationships between the police and the public. And this is how you repay her." The silence that followed was thick. The officers exchanged uneasy glances, realizing they had made a grave error. Some were visibly uncomfortable with how the situation was unfolding. David took a deep breath, his voice lowering as he addressed them again. "Now, I expect an apology, not just to my wife, but to anyone who witnessed this. You are in a position of trust, and this behavior is unacceptable." The lead officer, still trying to salvage the situation, cleared his throat. "Commissioner, David cut him off. "No, don't even try to justify it. There's no excuse for what happened here. You acted without reason, and now you're going to face the consequences." The officers looked around at each other, realizing that the commissioner wasn't going to let them get away with this. The severity of the situation was beginning to sink in. They had crossed a line, and now they were dealing with the fallout. David's eyes hardened as he spoke again, this time with an edge of finality in his voice. "I'll be reporting this incident to the chief of police immediately, and I will make sure this is investigated thoroughly." Eleanor, who had remained silent until now, looked up at her husband, her heart swelling with both pride and relief. She had known he would stand by her, but seeing him in action, the power in his voice, the way he commanded respect, left her in awe. The officers, now visibly deflated, nodded quietly. They knew the consequences of their actions were far from over. They had no choice but to face the truth of what they had done. David turned back to Eleanor, his expression softening. "Let's go home, Eleanor," he said, his tone gentler now. "This is over." But deep down, David knew that this was only the beginning of what would become a much larger issue. The officers had made a mistake, but the fallout from this would ripple through the police department, and he was determined to ensure that justice would be served. David and Eleanor drove home in silence, the weight of the evening's events hanging heavy in the air. As they passed familiar streets, Eleanor couldn't help but replay the moments at the gas station in her mind. The confusion, the frustration, the sense of helplessness, it all seemed so surreal. She had never imagined that something like this would happen to her, and certainly not in front of a crowd. David, however, was focused on what lay ahead. He had no intention of letting this go. The officers had made a mistake, one that could not be ignored. As much as he wanted to put the night behind them, he knew it was far from over. The situation wasn't just about him or Eleanor anymore. It was about the system, accountability, and making sure something like this never happened again. As they arrived at their home, David immediately pulled out his phone. The moment he stepped inside, he called the chief of police, explaining what had happened. He was calm but firm, demanding that an immediate investigation be launched. He couldn't shake the anger he felt, not just because of what happened to Eleanor, but because it represented a larger issue within the police force. This wasn't just about a mistake. It was about the trust that had been broken between the officers and the public. Eleanor sat down on the couch, her mind still racing. She was thankful that David had arrived when he did, that the whole ordeal left her feeling exposed, as though her privacy and dignity had been violated. She tried to remind herself that the officers had only acted out of ignorance, not malice, but the shame of being treated like a criminal still stung. As David hung up the phone, he turned to face her. "We'll get this sorted, Eleanor. I promise you that." His voice was filled with determination. He knew he had to take action, and he wasn't going to stop until those officers were held accountable. Eleanor nodded, though she still felt a knot in her stomach. I don't understand why they didn't check properly before jumping to conclusions. We shouldn't have been treated that way. No one should." David sat down beside her, his expression softening. "You're right. They should have treated you with respect. And they didn't. It's my job to make sure that doesn't happen again, not just for you, but for everyone." As the hours passed, the reality of the situation started to settle in. News of the wrongful detainment quickly spread, and soon, David was inundated with calls from the media, local officials, and even citizens who had witnessed the event. Everyone wanted to know what would be done. The pressure was mounting, and David knew he had to handle it with care. He couldn't afford to make any mistakes in how he responded. He decided to meet with the chief of police the following morning to discuss the situation in person. He was determined to ensure that not only would the officers involved face consequences, but there would be systemic changes in how stops and searches were conducted. The public trust had been shaken, and David knew it was his responsibility to help rebuild it. The night stretched on, and David and Eleanor finally turned in, but neither of them slept well. Eleanor couldn't shake the images of the officers searching her car, and David couldn't stop thinking about the steps he needed to take next. He knew that tomorrow would be a long day, but it was a necessary one. It wasn't just about defending his wife. It was about defending what was right. The morning arrived too soon for David and Eleanor. Neither of them had gotten much sleep, each wrestling with their own thoughts about what had happened the night before. Eleanor woke up to the sound of the birds outside their window, but the tranquility of the morning couldn't erase the sting of being wrongly accused. It was a deep, unsettling feeling, one she couldn't shake off. But she knew that David wouldn't rest until they got answers. David, on the other hand, had a heavy burden on his shoulders. As a commissioner, he understood the weight of his responsibility. He knew that this incident, though it started with a personal affront to his wife, was much bigger than just one wrongful stop. This was about the integrity of the police force, the trust of the community, and the very principles that they stood for. It wasn't just a mistake. It was a wake-up call. By the time they sat down for breakfast, David's phone had already started buzzing with calls and messages. The media had caught wind of the incident, and it wasn't long before local news stations were airing stories about the wrongful detainment. The public had started to react, and their reactions ranged from disbelief to anger. David knew that he couldn't just ignore it. "I'm going to meet with the chief this morning," David said as he took a sip of his coffee. He glanced at Eleanor, who sat quietly across from him, her fingers wrapped around her mug. Her gaze was distant, but David could see the concern in her eyes. She was worried, not just for herself, but for the larger impact this could have on their lives. "You need to take care of it, David," she said, her voice calm but firm. "But don't let them sweep this under the rug. People need to see that this kind of behavior isn't acceptable." David nodded. He could feel the weight of her words. This wasn't just about making things right for Eleanor. It was about ensuring that something like this never happened to anyone else. He couldn't let this go unanswered. He left the house shortly after breakfast, heading straight to the police station. The mood in the office was tense as he made his way to the chief's office. He'd spent years working alongside the chief, but today was different. Today, David wasn't just a colleague. He was a husband demanding justice for his wife. The chief was already waiting for him when he arrived. The look on the chief's face was a mixture of concern and uncertainty. He knew that this situation could spiral out of control, and it was clear that he wanted to handle it carefully. "David, I'm sorry you had to go through this," the chief said, standing up to greet him. "We'll get to the bottom of it." David didn't waste any time. "I need a full investigation into the officers involved. I want to know what happened, why it happened, and who was responsible for making the call to detain my wife without cause." The chief nodded. "I understand, and I'll make sure it's handled properly. But David, we need to make sure that we don't jump to conclusions before we have all the facts." David looked the chief in the eye. "I'm not jumping to conclusions. I know what happened, and what happened was wrong." The chief didn't argue. Instead, he sat back down, and the two men began discussing the next steps. David insisted that the officers involved be suspended pending the outcome of the investigation, and that a full review of their actions be conducted. He also pushed for transparency. He didn't want any part of this situation to be swept under the rug, as if it were just another small mistake. "I'm going to make sure this gets the attention it deserves," David said firmly. "The public needs to see that we hold ourselves to the highest standards." After the meeting, David returned home, ready to share what had transpired. He knew the investigation would take time, but he was satisfied with the direction it was headed. Eleanor, though still shaken by the events, felt a sense of relief knowing that her husband was taking the steps to ensure accountability. As the day went on, more details about the incident came to light, and the public reaction grew louder. News outlets picked up the story, and soon there were calls for change in the way police officers handled stops and searches. David's stance on the matter was clear. He wasn't going to let this go quietly. The officers had made a mistake, and they were going to face the consequences. Eleanor, although still processing what had happened, couldn't help but feel a sense of pride in her husband. He wasn't just standing up for her, he was standing up for what was right. And that, more than anything, gave her hope that things could change for the better. The next few days unfolded in a blur for David and Eleanor. The incident at the gas station quickly became the talk of the town. The media didn't waste any time picking up the story, and soon it was being covered on the evening news. Social media was buzzing with opinions, some in support of Eleanor, others questioning why the officers hadn't followed protocol. But one thing was clear. The community had been shaken by the wrongful detainment, and people were eager to see what would happen next. David worked tirelessly to ensure that the investigation was moving forward. He knew that this was more than just a personal matter. It was an opportunity to make a meaningful change. The public's trust in law enforcement had been damaged, and it was his responsibility to restore it. He didn't want this situation to be swept under the rug or forgotten. He wanted real accountability. The officers involved in the wrongful stop were placed on administrative leave while the investigation took place. David insisted on full transparency, ensuring that the public would have access to all the details of the investigation as it progressed. He knew that keeping the process open and honest was the only way to regain the community's trust. Meanwhile, Eleanor focused on finding some semblance of normalcy. She had always been an active member of the community, volunteering and participating in various charity events. But now she found herself becoming more of a public figure than she ever anticipated. While she didn't ask for this attention, she couldn't deny the positive impact it was having. People reached out to her, offering their support, and some even shared their own stories of similar encounters with the police. Eleanor was hesitant at first, unsure of how to respond. She never wanted to make the situation about herself. But over time, she realized that by speaking out, she could help others who had experienced similar injustices. She began to share her story, not just to bring attention to her own situation, but to raise awareness about the broader issue of police misconduct. David watched as Eleanor found her voice. He admired her strength and her determination to turn a painful experience into something meaningful. He knew that she was helping to pave the way for change, and that made him even more committed to ensuring justice was served. As the investigation continued, the department made several key changes. They reviewed the protocols for detaining individuals and conducting searches, emphasizing the importance of verifying identities and having clear, justifiable reasons for any actions taken. David pushed for better training on de-escalation techniques and a more compassionate approach to handling citizens, especially in situations where misunderstandings could easily occur. The public reaction to the changes was mixed. Some people felt that the steps taken weren't enough, while others appreciated the department's willingness to address the issue openly. But one thing was clear: the conversation had begun, and people were paying attention. For the first time in a long while, there was a real dialogue about the need for reform in law enforcement. A few weeks later, the officers involved in the detainment were given their due consequences. The department decided to suspend them for a period of time, pending further review of their actions. While the decision didn't satisfy everyone, David felt it was a step in the right direction. He knew that real change would take time, but this was a beginning. For David and Eleanor, the ordeal had been a long and difficult journey. But through it all, they had come to realize that standing up for what's right wasn't always easy, and it wasn't always popular, but it was necessary. And in the end, that's what mattered. They had faced an injustice together, and they had made sure it was addressed in a way that would hopefully make a difference for others in the future. As the weeks passed, the story of Eleanor's wrongful detainment slowly began to fade from the headlines, but its impact lingered. The investigation was officially closed, and while the officers involved faced disciplinary action, the changes David had pushed for were still in motion. For both David and Eleanor, the experience had left an indelible mark, but it also sparked a commitment to ensure that such an incident would never be repeated. David continued to work on his role as commissioner, determined to implement reforms that would make the police force more accountable to the public. He made it clear that the department had to evolve, adapting to the needs of the community it served. It wasn't just about punishing individuals who made mistakes. It was about changing the culture of law enforcement so that respect and understanding were at the forefront of every officer's training. Eleanor, though not someone who sought attention, felt a growing sense of responsibility. The whole ordeal had opened her eyes to the larger issues surrounding law enforcement and its relationship with the public. She had heard from countless people who had gone through similar experiences, people who had felt powerless, ignored, or unfairly targeted. She realized that by sharing her story, she could contribute to the change that was needed. While she never intended for her personal experience to become a public platform, Eleanor began speaking out more, participating in town hall meetings and local discussions about police reform. She was determined to help create a community where people felt safe and respected, no matter their background or appearance. What started as a deeply painful moment in her life had transformed into a chance to make a difference. At home, things were beginning to return to normal for David and Eleanor. The tension from the incident had subsided, and the support they received from friends, family, and the public had helped ease some of the emotional weight. They spent time together, enjoying the simple moments that had been overshadowed by the ordeal. Their bond had only grown stronger, and David couldn't have been more proud of his wife's strength throughout the entire process. David and Eleanor also made sure to take time for themselves. They took walks in the park, enjoyed quiet evenings at home, and traveled to visit friends they hadn't seen in a while. It was their way of reconnecting, of putting the painful memories behind them and focusing on what truly mattered, each other and the life they were building together. The incident had changed both of them in ways they hadn't expected. It had reminded them of the importance of standing up for what's right, no matter how difficult it may seem. It had shown them that true change often came from the courage to confront uncomfortable truths and take action. They knew that while the process of reform would take time, their actions, no matter how small, could contribute to a better future. As the years went on, the story of the wrongful detainment became a chapter in their lives that they could look back on, knowing they had done their part to make a difference. It had been a difficult journey, but in the end, it had shaped who they were and reinforced their commitment to justice and fairness. David and Eleanor had not just survived the incident. They had used it as an opportunity to create a ripple effect that extended beyond their personal lives, affecting the community around them. The change they had worked toward, though still in progress, was something they both felt proud of. And while the road ahead was long, they knew they had taken the first steps toward a better future, one built on accountability, respect, and the belief that everyone deserves to be treated with dignity.